The moment my sister said it, my son's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth, like his body knew the sentence was going to hurt before his mind did. Everyone waited for me to apologize for my life again, but I had brought a folder to dinner, and it was not about proving I was fine. It was about exposing who had been quietly building their perfect family on someone else's name, specifically my 10-year-old child's. My name is Kendall Graham, and I had learned long ago that in my family, affection was a finite resource that had to be purchased with compliance. We were gathered for Sunday dinner at my parents' house in West Briar, North Carolina, a sprawling brick colonial that sat on a hill as if it were looking down on the rest of the neighborhood. The driveway was lined with manicured boxwoods that looked sharp enough to draw blood if you brushed against them too casually. This was the stage where we performed the weekly pageant of being a happy family, a production directed by my mother and starring my younger sister. Inside, the air smelled of roasting rosemary and furniture polish. It was a cold, chemical scent that I always associated with judgment. The dining room table was set with the kind of precision that made you afraid to sit down. Heavy linen napkins, stiff with starch, were folded into intricate pyramids. The silverware was real silver, polished to a mirror shine that distorted your reflection when you looked at it. Crystal water goblets caught the light from the chandelier, casting fractured rainbows across the mahogany surface. It was beautiful, objectively speaking, but it felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit where the velvet ropes had been temporarily lowered. I took my seat, smoothing my skirt with a nervous habit I was trying to break. Beside me sat my 10-year-old son, Eli. He looked small in the high-backed dining chair, his feet barely touching the Persian rug beneath. He was quiet, possessing that careful stillness children develop when they learn that their natural volume is considered an offense. He kept his hands in his lap, twisting a loose thread on his jeans, his eyes darting toward the head of the table where my father, Ray, was carving the roast beef with surgical concentration. Across from us sat my sister, Sloane, and her husband, Grant. Sloane was in her element. She played the role of hostess even in our mother's house, moving with a frenetic energy that she tried to pass off as effortless grace. She poured wine, adjusted the centerpiece, and critiqued the lighting, acting as if she were curating a lifestyle brand rather than eating a meal with her relatives. Her hair was a perfect blonde curtain, her skin glowing from expensive treatments, and her smile was fixed in place like it had been pinned there. Grant sat next to her, smiling too much. He had the demeanor of a man who was perpetually trying to sell you something you did not need. His teeth were too white, his laugh too ready, and his eyes always seemed to be scanning the room for an exit or a better offer. He wore a cashmere sweater that looked soft, but likely cost more than my monthly car payment. They were the golden couple, the standard against which I was constantly measured and found wanting. My mother, Janine, emerged from the kitchen carrying a tureen of gravy. She set it down with a satisfied sigh, looking around the table with a gaze that demanded gratitude. "Everything looks wonderful, Mom," Sloane said, her voice pitching up an octave. She reached over to straighten Grant's collar, a possessive little gesture that made my stomach turn. "Doesn't it, Kendall?" "It looks delicious," I said, keeping my voice neutral. I reached for the water pitcher to fill Eli's glass. "Careful," Sloane snapped, her hand shooting out to hover near mine. "That is the antique crystal. It is heavy." "I can handle a pitcher." "Sloane," I said, pouring the water. My hand was steady, though my pulse was beginning to race. "I just know you are tired," she said, leaning back and taking a sip of her wine. "You look exhausted. Kendall, are they working you into the ground at that bank?" "I work in compliance," I corrected her, a distinction I had made a dozen times before. "And yes, it is a busy season. Fraud doesn't sleep." "Fraud," Grant chuckled, a hollow sound. "Sounds intense. I do not know how you handle looking at spreadsheets all day. I need people. I need the energy of the deal." I looked at Grant. I knew things about his deals that would wipe that smile off his face, but I kept my expression pleasant. "It is not just spreadsheets, Grant. It is about seeing the things people try to hide." The conversation drifted into the safe, shallow waters of local gossip and the weather. We passed bowls of mashed potatoes and glazed carrots. The only sound for a long time was the clinking of heavy forks against china and the scraping of knives. It was a polite sound, masking the tension that hummed beneath the surface like a high-voltage wire. Eli was picking at his food. He had barely touched the roast beef. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, wanting to tell him it was okay, that we would stop for burgers on the way home if he was hungry later, but I knew better than to whisper at this table. Whispering drew attention. Sloane's eyes locked onto Eli. I saw the shift happen. She was bored with the weather, bored with the silence, and she needed a target. "Eli," she said, her voice deceptively sweet. "How is the piano coming along? Mom said you struggled with the recital piece last week." Eli froze. He looked up, his eyes wide and deer-like. He swallowed hard. "I did okay. It is a hard song." "It is a hard song," I interjected, stepping in before she could dig deeper. "He is learning Chopin. It takes time." "Well, sure," Sloane said, dismissing me with a wave of her fork. "But focus is everything. My Connor is already looking at prep schools, and they look for mastery, not just participation. You have to push through the hard parts. Eli, you cannot just give up when it gets tricky." "I didn't give up," Eli said softly, his voice barely a murmur. "What was that?" Sloane asked, leaning forward. "Speak up, honey. We can hardly hear you." "I didn't give up," Eli said, a little louder this time, though his voice trembled. "I just messed up the tempo in the second movement." Sloane smirked. It was a small, tight expression, one that vanished as quickly as it appeared. But I saw it. It was the look of a predator who had found a limp. She took a slow bite of a carrot, chewed deliberately, and then set her fork down. "You know," she began, wiping the corner of her mouth with the linen napkin, "it is not really your fault. Eli, it is hard to have discipline when things are so chaotic at home." The air left the room. I felt my spine stiffen, every muscle in my back locking into place. "Our home is not chaotic." "Sloane," she ignored me, keeping her gaze on my son. "I just think about it sometimes. The psychology of it. Maybe if your son had 2 parents, he wouldn't be such a mess." The sentence hung over the centerpiece like a toxic cloud. The room froze. The clinking of forks stopped instantly. The only sound was the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting off the seconds of my humiliation. Eli's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, then at Sloane, and then down at his plate. His face went pale, draining of color as if he had been physically struck. He knew, with the intuition of a child who has been the subject of too many adult conversations, that he was the problem. He was the broken thing that could not be fixed. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to step in, waiting for her to say that was enough, waiting for her to protect her grandson. Janine cleared her throat, but she did not look angry. She looked pained, as if Sloane's cruelty was simply a clumsy truth. "Now, Sloane," my mother said, her voice soft and fluttering. "That is a bit harsh. We know Kendall is doing the best she can." "I am just concerned," Sloane said, holding up her hands in mock surrender. "I am the only one brave enough to say it. A boy needs a father figure. He needs a model of success. Look at him. He is anxious. He is timid. That does not happen in a vacuum. It is about structure." My father, Ray, added, not looking up from his plate. He sliced a piece of meat with deliberate force. "Stability. A child needs to know where the boundaries are. Kendall has always been a bit free-spirited with the rules. It is no wonder the boy is confused." I felt the blood rushing in my ears, a roaring sound like the ocean. They were doing it again. They were rewriting reality to fit their narrative. In their version of the world, I was the chaotic, grieving widow who could not manage her life, and Sloane was the paragon of virtue. They were sliding the blame onto me, layering it over my shoulders like a heavy coat, without ever owning their own malice. "My kids," Sloane continued, warming to her theme now that she had backup, "know what is expected of them. They excel because Grant and I present a united front. We show them what success looks like every day. Children are like sponges. Kendall, they absorb what is around them. If they see struggle, they struggle. If they see success, they succeed. She spoke as if her children were trophies she polished in public, shiny objects devoid of their own humanity, existing only to validate her life choices. She spoke as if my husband's death was a failure of character on my part, a lack of planning that I had inflicted on my son. Eli set his spoon down on the tablecloth. The sound was soft, a dull thud against the fabric, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a gavel. "I am not hungry," he murmured. He did not look up. He stared at the damask pattern of the tablecloth, his shoulders hunched inward as if he were trying to make himself disappear. He looked defeated. He looked exactly the way they wanted him to look: broken, lesser, a mess. I looked at my family. I looked at Sloane, who was taking a sip of wine with a look of self-righteous satisfaction. I looked at Grant, who was studying the label on the wine bottle to avoid eye contact. I looked at my parents, who were already returning to their food, comfortable in the belief that they had dispensed necessary wisdom. Something inside me snapped. It was not a loud break. It was a quiet, clean fracture, like a piece of ice cracking under pressure. For years, I had sat at this table and swallowed their insults. I had told myself that keeping the peace was the most important thing. I had told myself that Eli needed his grandparents, his cousins, his family. I had convinced myself that their criticism was rooted in love, however twisted. But looking at my son's slumped shoulders, I realized I had been wrong. This wasn't love. It was a hierarchy. They needed Eli to be a mess so they could feel superior. They needed me to be the failure so they could be the success. I reached out and squeezed Eli's shoulder. His muscles were tight, rock hard with tension. I kept my hand there, a silent promise. I was done. I was done letting this table teach my son he was less. I was done apologizing for a tragedy I didn't cause. I was done pretending that their perfect life was anything other than a facade. I felt the weight of the folder in my purse, resting on the floor beside my chair. I had brought it with me tonight, not knowing if I would use it. I had told myself it was just a safety net, a precaution. But as Sloane smirked over her dessert, preparing to launch into another monologue about her brilliant parenting, I knew the time for precautions was over. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of roast beef and furniture polish one last time. It was the smell of my childhood, the smell of my submission, and I decided, right then and there, that it was a smell I was never going to tolerate again. The spoon Eli had set down was the only signal I needed. The dinner was over. The reckoning was about to begin. I forced my lungs to expand, counting the seconds in my head, 1, 2, 3, before I dared to exhale. In this house, in this dining room, under the crystal chandelier, emotion was treated like a spilled drink, a messy, embarrassing accident that needed to be cleaned up immediately so everyone could pretend it never happened. If I cried, I was unstable. If I yelled, I was hysterical. If I walked out, I was running away. The only option they left me was to sit there and swallow the glass, smiling while it cut my throat. I kept my hands folded in my lap, anchoring myself to the chair. I knew the script they were reading from. It was their favorite story, a well-worn paperback they passed around at every gathering. The title was Poor Kendall, and the plot was always the same. I was the cautionary tale. I was the sister who was barely getting by, the daughter who was working too much, the widow who was living too small. They loved this story because it made them the heroes. As long as I was the tragedy, they got to be the saviors, benevolent and wise. Looking down from their pedestals of unearned security, Sloane took another sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with that specific brightness that came from knowing she had landed a direct hit. She looked around the table, gathering her audience. "I am just saying," she continued, her voice dropping to that confessional tone she used when she wanted to sound intimate while being invasive. "We worry about you. Kendall, we really do. That condo of yours, it is just so small. How can a boy Eli's age have any room to grow in a place like that? It feels like a holding cell. My condo was 1,200 square feet of clean, bright space that I had bought with my own money. Money I earned by working 50 hours a week. It had a balcony where Eli grew tomatoes in the summer and a living room where we built elaborate forts out of blankets on rainy Saturdays. It was our sanctuary. But to Sloane, it was proof of my decline. It is 2 bedrooms and 2 baths. Sloane, I said, keeping my voice level, stripping it of any defensiveness. It is perfectly adequate for the 2 of us. Eli likes it. We are close to the park. The park? My father. Ray grunted, shaking his head as he buttered a roll with aggressive strokes. Public parks. You never know who is lurking around in places like that. Grant and Sloane have that fenced yard. Acres of it. That is where a boy should be running. Safe, secure, private. We just want what is best. My mother, Janine, chimed in, her face arranged in a mask of tragic concern. You work such long hours, honey. And for what? To live in a building where you share walls with strangers, it just seems so hard, so unnecessary. They made my independence sound like a disease. They made my career in compliance sound like manual labor. They acted as if my paycheck was an allowance I had to beg for, rather than a salary that put food on my table and clothes on my back. I like my job, I said, though I knew it did not matter. And I like our home. But is it a home? Sloane asked, tilting her head. Or is it just a place you are crashing until you figure out your life? It has been 4 years. Kendall, you are still living like you are in survival mode. 4 years. They threw the number around like it was nothing. 4 years since the highway patrol officer knocked on my door at 3 a.m. 4 years since the air was sucked out of my universe. They talked about my late husband, Logan, not as a man who had laughed and loved and played the guitar badly on the back porch, but as a mistake I had made, a clerical error in my life plan, to them. Logan was the reason I was less. He was the cautionary tale. He was the man who died without a 7-figure life insurance policy, the man who hadn't secured a trust fund for his son before he hit 30. They stripped him of his humanity and reduced him to a balance sheet that didn't add up. Logan provided for us, I said, my voice tightening just a fraction. We are doing fine. Fine is a low bar, Grant said, chuckling as if he were letting me in on a joke. We want you to thrive, Kendall. We want you to be securely positioned. I looked down at Eli. He had pushed his plate away entirely. He was tracing the pattern of the lace tablecloth with one finger, over and over, trapped in a loop of anxiety. I needed to shift the narrative. I needed to remind them that my son was not a victim, and I was not a charity case. Eli made the honor roll again this quarter, I said, my voice cutting through their murmurs of pity. High honors, straight A's across the board. I waited for the praise. I waited for a good job or a high five. That is nice, Janine said vaguely, patting her mouth with her napkin. Although, I hear the public school standards have really dropped lately. Everyone gets an A these days. It is like participation trophies. I felt a flash of heat behind my eyes. He also volunteers at the animal rescue every Saturday morning. I pressed on. He helps socialize the dogs that have been abused. It takes a lot of patience and empathy. The director says he has a gift. Sloane laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. Walking dogs. That is cute, I guess. But is it going to get him into a good college? Connor is doing coding camp and Mandarin immersion. We are focusing on skills that translate to the real world. Empathy is sweet, Kendall, but empathy does not pay the mortgage. He plays the piano, I said, my voice getting quieter, more dangerous. He is learning classical pieces that most adults cannot play. We heard, Sloane said, rolling her eyes. He struggled with the tempo. We just talked about this. You are letting him dabble. Kendall, you are letting him drift. He needs focus. He needs a strong hand. He is 10, I said. He needs to be a child. He needs a father, Ray said, pointing his fork at me. That is the long and short of it. You are trying to do a two-person job with one person's energy, and it shows. The boy is soft. He is quiet. He needs a man to toughen him up. I looked at Grant. Soft, smiling Grant, who had never done a day of manual labor in his life, who paid people to mow his lawn and fix his car. This was their idea of a man. A guy who wore loafers without socks and talked about synergy. Grant takes the boys camping, Janine said, beaming at her son-in-law. He teaches them how to build fires, how to be self-sufficient. I took Eli camping last month, I said. We went to the state park. Glamping, Sloane sneered. I saw the pictures. You had an air mattress. It was a tent, I said. In the woods. It is not the same. Ray dismissed me. It is different when a woman does it. It is play acting. I looked at Eli again. He had shrunk in his chair. His head bowed so low his chin touched his chest. He was absorbing every word. He was learning that his grades didn't matter because his school wasn't expensive enough. He was learning that his kindness to animals was a waste of time because it wasn't profitable. He was learning that his mother was a failure and his father was a ghost who had abandoned him to a life of mediocrity. You compare him to Connor and Liam constantly, I said, looking directly at my mother. You pit them against each other. It is not healthy. It is motivation, Janine insisted, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. Healthy competition builds character. We just want Eli to see what is possible. We want him to strive for more than this. She gestured vaguely at me, at my clothes, at my existence. Shame is not a parenting tool, I said. It is not shame, Sloane snapped. It is reality. Look, Kendall, I know you are sensitive. I know you are fragile because of everything you have been through. But you cannot protect him from the truth forever. The world is competitive. The world is hard. If you coddle him, if you let him be mediocre, the world is going to eat him alive. She leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the light. Maybe if you stopped pretending everything was perfect and admitted you needed help, things would change. Maybe if you let Dad and Grant step in and guide him, he would not be so lost. She stared right at me, that smirk playing on her lips again. It was a look that dared me to explode. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to shout so she could turn to Grant and say, "See, I told you she was unhinged." She wanted to win, but as I looked at her perfect hair, her perfect teeth, her perfect husband, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that usually burned hot and chaotic in my chest cooled down into something solid. It hardened into a blade. I realized then that they weren't worried about Eli. They didn't care about his grades or his piano or his future. They didn't care that he was kind or smart or funny. They only cared about the hierarchy. This family was a pyramid, and for Sloane to stay at the top, basking in the sun of my parents' approval, someone had to be at the bottom, holding the whole thing up. I was the designated loser. I was the contrast that made Sloane's colors look brighter. My struggle was the fuel for her ego. Kids need a strong example of success, Sloane repeated, her voice dripping with condescension. They need to see what winning looks like. I felt the weight of my purse against my ankle. Inside, the folder sat against my wallet. It contained 12 pages of printed documents, 12 pages of timestamps, IP addresses, transaction logs, and credit applications. 12 pages that told a very different story about winning and success. I had brought the folder because I was tired of the lies, but I hadn't planned to use it. I had thought, foolishly, that maybe tonight would be different, that maybe they would let us eat a meal in peace, that maybe, if I was quiet enough and polite enough, they would leave my son alone, but they couldn't. It wasn't in their nature. They were vampires of self-esteem, and they were feeding on my 10-year-old boy. I touched the strap of my purse. The leather was cool under my fingertips. Tonight wasn't about defending myself anymore. I could take their insults. I had taken them for 35 years. I could handle being the black sheep, the disappointment, the cautionary tale. But I would be damned if I let them turn my son into collateral damage in their ego games. They wanted a strong example of success. They wanted to talk about reality. They wanted to discuss who was a mess and who was stable fine. I took a sip of my water. It was cool and crisp. I set the glass down with a deliberate, steady hand. "You are right, Sloane," I said quietly. She blinked, surprised by my agreement. Yes, I said. "Kids do need to see what reality looks like. They need to know the difference between the truth and a performance." I reached down and picked up my purse. I heard the rustle of papers inside. It was the sound of a weapon being loaded. "I am glad we are having this conversation," I said, unzipping the bag. "Because there are some things about success and stability that we really need to clear up." The folder came out. It was a plain manila folder, innocent-looking, bought in a pack of 50 from the office supply store, but as I laid it on the table, right next to the crystal water pitcher, it felt heavier than a brick. The time for silence was over. The time for protection had begun. And the story they loved so much, the story of poor Kendall and perfect Sloane, was about to get a rewritten ending that none of them saw coming. To my family, my career was a vaguely defined administrative role that they assumed involved counting cash or stamping loan applications at a bank branch window. They pictured me standing behind a velvet rope, wearing a polyester blazer, asking customers for their identification while they deposited birthday checks. They could not have been more wrong. I did not work in a branch, and I certainly did not deal with customers face to face. I worked in the corporate headquarters of Cedar Line Financial Group, on the 14th floor, behind a badge access door that required security clearance. My official title was Senior Compliance Analyst in the Fraud Prevention Unit. My job was not to count money. My job was to see the invisible strings that people attach to their money. I spent my days staring at dual monitors, tracking digital footprints, and hunting for the discrepancies that signaled a lie. I was a professional skeptic. I looked for patterns, velocity triggers, structuring, synthetic identities, and the quiet, desperate shuffling of funds that preceded a financial collapse. In my world, people were not who they said they were. They were data points. They were credit scores and transaction histories. They were the sum of their choices. And unlike in social settings, the numbers never lied. You could smile at a dinner party and wear a Rolex. But if your debt-to-income ratio was 60% and you were kiting checks between 3 different banks, my system would know before your spouse did. 2 weeks before that Sunday dinner, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the system decided to tell me something I had never wanted to know. It was 2 p.m, the time of day when the office hummed with the low, steady rhythm of typing and the whir of the HVAC system. I was working through a queue of automated alerts, the kind generated by our algorithm when an account hit a specific risk threshold. Most of them were false positives, someone making a large purchase for a wedding or traveling out of the country without notifying us. Routine stuff. I was clearing them with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who had done this for a decade. Click, review, verify, clear. Click, review, verify, clear. Then the next file opened. The alert was coded Red 4, which meant a high-velocity credit inquiry combined with a discrepancy in the provided address history. I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee and leaned in to check the details, expecting to see a stranger's name. Instead, I saw the address, 442 Oak Ridge Drive, West Briar, North Carolina. My stomach dropped. The coffee turned to acid in my throat. I knew that address. I had been there for Christmas. I had been there for birthdays. I had stood in the marble foyer and admired the custom wainscoting. It was Sloane and Grant's house. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. For a moment, my brain refused to process the information. It had to be a mistake, a glitch. Maybe someone had stolen their mail. Maybe it was an identity theft case where they were the victims. That happened all the time. I felt a surge of protective instinct. I needed to call Sloane, to warn her that someone was trying to use their address. But the training kicked in compliance. You do not make calls based on gut feelings. You follow the data. You follow the paper trail until it ends. I looked at the name attached to the alert. It was Grant's name, Grant Miller. But the social security number attached to the inquiry was flagged as mismatched. I should have recused myself right then. The company policy was clear about conflicts of interest involving family members or personal acquaintances. The ethical thing to do was to flag it for a supervisor, close the file, and walk away. I knew that. I had signed the handbook every year, but I froze. If I flagged this for a supervisor, it became official. It became an investigation. If this was just a misunderstanding or a small error, bringing in a third party would escalate it instantly. I told myself I was just doing a preliminary review, just a quick look to see if it was a system error so I could dismiss it and save them the embarrassment. I clicked deeper into the file, and as I peeled back the layers of my sister's financial life, the perfect family narrative began to dissolve like sugar in hot water. The alert had been triggered by an application for a personal line of credit, a big one, $50,000. That in itself wasn't a crime, but the income stated on the application was pure fiction. Grant had listed his employment as a senior executive at a logistics firm, a job I knew he had left 6 months ago. He had told us he was consulting now, taking time to find the right opportunity, but on the application, he claimed a salary of $250,000 a year. I pulled up their linked accounts. Cedar Line held their primary mortgage and 2 of their credit cards. The mortgage was not just late. It was in the pre-foreclosure danger zone. They were 90 days past due. The system showed 3 returned payments in the last 4 months, insufficient funds. They had been paying the minimums on their credit cards, then using cash advances from one card to pay the other. A classic circular financing scheme that screamed desperation. They were bleeding money. The country club memberships, the leased luxury SUVs, the private school tuitions, it was all being floated on a bubble of debt that was about to burst. I felt a cold sweat prickling the back of my neck. I looked around the office, paranoid that someone could see what I was seeing. My sister, who lectured me about living small, was technically insolvent, but that wasn't the part that made me sick. People have money trouble. People lie about their jobs. It happens. It is sad, but it is not evil. I went back to the original alert, the mismatched Social Security number on the credit application. The algorithm had flagged it because the birth date associated with the number did not match Grant's birth date. I expanded the field to see the number that had been entered. 9 digits. Black text on a white background. I knew those numbers. I recited them in my head. A sequence I had memorized the day my son was born. I had written them on doctor's forms, school registrations, and insurance cards. It was Eli's Social Security number. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white. I blinked, hoping the numbers would change, hoping I was hallucinating from lack of sleep. But they stayed there. Someone had used my 10-year-old son's Social Security number to apply for a $50,000 line of credit in Grant Miller's name. The timestamp on the application was from 3 days prior. The IP address traced back to a residential service provider in West Briar. My mind raced, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a typo. Maybe Grant had meant to type his own number and his finger slipped. But Grant was 42 years old. Eli was 10. Their numbers were not similar. And the birth date entered on the application wasn't Grant's, it was a modified date, changed just enough to bypass the immediate age filter. But the core identifier remained Eli's. This wasn't an accident. This was synthetic identity fraud. They were trying to build a credit file using a child's clean slate because their own credit was too toxic to pass underwriting. They were using my son as a fresh host for their parasitic lifestyle. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to swallow hard to keep from gagging. This was not just financial irresponsibility. This was a crime. It was a federal offense, and it was a personal betrayal so deep I couldn't find the bottom of it. Sloan, who smirked at my sad little condo, was trying to saddle my son with debt before he was even old enough to drive. I sat there for a long time, the glow of the monitors illuminating my face. The office noise faded into a dull roar. I thought about the dinner invitation for Sunday. I thought about the way they would look at me, the way they would criticize Eli. I knew what I had to do. I did not go to my supervisor. Not yet. If I reported this internally right now, the fraud department would launch a full investigation. Police reports would be filed. Grant could be arrested. Sloan could be implicated. It would destroy the family. My parents would never forgive me for misunderstanding or rushing to judgment. I needed to be absolutely sure, and I needed leverage. I hit the print command. I printed the mortgage delinquency notices. I printed the transaction logs showing the circular transfers. I printed the credit card statements that showed thousands of dollars spent on designer clothes and spa treatments, while the house payment bounced. And finally, I printed the credit application with Eli's social security number highlighted in the system's red warning box. I took the pages from the printer, my hands trembling slightly. I organized them chronologically. I placed them in a plain manila folder and sealed it with a metal clasp. I put the folder in my locked drawer and left the office, walking out into the rain without an umbrella. For 2 weeks, I carried that secret. I carried it like a stone in my gut. I went to work. I made dinner for Eli. I helped him with his piano practice. Every time I looked at him, at his innocent face, I felt a fresh surge of rage. He trusted the adults in his life to protect him, and the very people who claimed to be his role models were trying to rob him of his future. I debated not going to the dinner. I debated calling the police immediately. I debated calling my mother and screaming the truth over the phone, but I knew how this family worked. If I came at them with emotion, they would gaslight me. They would tell me I was crazy, that I was misinterpreting things, that it was a simple mistake I was blowing out of proportion. They would close ranks. Grant would come up with a slick explanation, and Sloan would cry, and my parents would tell me to stop causing trouble. I needed to be in the room. I needed to see their faces when the mask slipped. So I brought the folder. I put it in my purse, right next to my wallet. I told myself I would only use it if I had to. If they were kind, if they were decent, if they left Eli alone, maybe I would pull Grant aside quietly later. Maybe I would give them a chance to fix it before I filed the formal fraud report. I wanted to believe they were capable of shame. But then came the dessert. Then came the smirk. Then came the comment about my son being a mess because he didn't have a father. Sitting there at the table, listening to Sloan weaponize her perfect life against my child. The last shred of hesitation evaporated. I looked at the folder sitting on the table where I had placed it. It looked innocuous, just a collection of paper, but I knew what was inside. It was the truth. Cold, hard, verified truth. Sloan thought she was fighting a battle of wits. She thought this was just another sisterly spat where she could use her sharp tongue to cut me down. She didn't realize she had brought a knife to a nuclear war. I worked in compliance. My job was to enforce the rules. And rule number 1 was that you do not steal. Rule number 2 was that you do not lie on federal documents. And rule number 3, the one I was about to write into the family bylaws, was that you do not touch my son. I looked at Sloan, really looked at her, and saw the fear hiding behind her eyes. She knew things were crumbling. She just didn't know that I knew too. "Do you want to explain your delinquency timeline?" I had asked. I watched Grant's face as the question landed. I wasn't the sister-in-law anymore. I wasn't the poor widow. I was the senior compliance analyst, and I had just opened a case file on their lives. To understand why I finally placed that folder on the dining table, you have to understand the 4 years of silence that preceded it. The explosion at Sunday dinner was not a sudden event. It was the result of a slow, pressurized leak that had been filling the room with gas since the day my husband died. 4 years earlier, my life had been a different shape. It was symmetrical. It was full. Then came a rainy Tuesday night, a slick patch of asphalt on Highway 95, and a tractor trailer that jackknifed across 2 lanes. In the span of a single heartbeat, my world split into 2 distinct eras, the before and the after. Logan was not just a husband or a father, he was the buffer. He was the one who could laugh off my family's passive-aggressive comments with a joke that made them feel silly for trying to be mean. He was the shield that stood between Eli and the sharper edges of the Graham family dynamic. When he died, that shield disintegrated, and suddenly, my 6-year-old son and I were standing in the open, exposed to the elements. The grief was a physical weight, a heavy blanket that made it hard to breathe or move. But while I was trying to figure out how to wake up in the morning without my partner, my sister Sloan was figuring out how to brand my tragedy. I remember standing in the funeral home, numb and hollow, watching people file past the casket. Sloane was there, wearing a black dress that was just a little too fashionable for the occasion. Her makeup flawless. She hugged me, and I felt her phone pressed against my back. Later that night, I saw the notification. She had posted a photo of herself looking mournfully out a window with a caption about the fragility of life and the burden of being a strong sister. It had 300 likes and dozens of comments praising her resilience. She had harvested my worst nightmare for engagement metrics. That was the beginning. In the months that followed, Sloane delivered cruelty in quiet, measured doses, always disguised as sympathy. I remember the first Thanksgiving after the accident. It had been 7 months. I was still raw, walking around with nerves that felt like they were on the outside of my skin. We were at my parents' house, the same setting as our current Sunday dinners. I was helping clear the table, trying to be useful so I would not have to talk. Sloane was in the kitchen, scraping plates. She looked at me, then at Eli, who was sitting in the living room watching the parade on television alone. "It is just so sad," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was meant to be overheard. "Looking at the holiday card list this year, it feels strange to send one to your house. You are like half a family now." Half a family. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. It suggested that without a man, without the traditional structure, Eli and I were incomplete. We were a fraction. We were a broken recipe that would never taste right again. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the serving platter I was holding against the wall. But I didn't. I swallowed the rage because I had been taught that keeping the peace was the highest virtue a woman could possess. I told myself she didn't mean it that way. I told myself she was just clumsy with her words. But Eli heard things too. The narrative that my son was a mess was one they constructed brick by brick. They looked at a grieving boy and labeled his sadness as dysfunction. Eli did not become a mess. He became cautious. He learned, at the age of 7, that his words were being graded. He saw how my mother would sigh when he didn't want to play football with the cousins. He saw how Grant would make loud, booming jokes, and then look disappointed when Eli didn't laugh. He stopped running into rooms. He stopped shouting with joy. He started checking the temperature of the room before he spoke, scanning the adults' faces to see if he was safe. My family looked at his caution and called it social awkwardness. They looked at his quiet observation and called it timidity. They didn't realize that words from family land deeper than words from strangers. When a bully at school says something mean, you can brush it off. When your aunt says you are struggling while you are sitting right there, it becomes part of your identity. I kept attending those dinners because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I stopped going, I would be proving them right. I feared they would say I was bitter, that I was wallowing, that I was cutting Eli off from his heritage. I believed that endurance was a form of love. I thought that if I just showed up, if I just kept smiling, if I just brought the right side dish and ignored the barbs, eventually they would respect us. I thought compromise was maturity, so I worked. They loved to say I was barely getting by, painting a picture of a frantic, chaotic single mother drowning in bills. The reality was a boring, disciplined grind. I took the job at Cedar Line Financial Group because it offered the best health insurance and a matching retirement plan. I worked 50 hours a week, not because I was disorganized, but because I was building a fortress of security for my son. I paid for private grief counseling for both of us, which cost $200 an hour. I paid for his piano lessons. I paid the mortgage on our condo. I put money into a college fund every single month. I came home at 6, cooked dinner, checked homework, and read to Eli until he fell asleep. Then I would log back in and work until midnight to make sure my queue was clear. I was tired, yes, but I wasn't drowning. I was swimming a marathon with a 50-pound weight strapped to my back, and I was making good time. My family didn't see the spreadsheets. They didn't see the growing savings account. They only saw that I drove a sedan that was 5 years old instead of a leased luxury SUV. They saw that I wore the same winter coat for 3 seasons. To them, these were signs of failure. To me, they were choices. Then there was the dating issue. Sloane loved to bring this up. usually after her third glass of wine. "You know, Kendall," she would say, "Grant has a friend from the club, divorced, a little older, but he has money. You really need to get back out there. It is not healthy to be alone." I avoided dating, but not out of fear. I wasn't pining for a replacement husband. I wasn't afraid of men. I made a calculated decision that Eli needed space. He had lost the most important man in his life, bringing a parade of strangers into our home, risking more loss, risking confusion. It wasn't worth it. I wanted our home to be the one place where he didn't have to perform or adapt. I wanted to be his constant, but to my family, my single status was just another symptom of my deficiency. It was proof that I was stuck. Meanwhile, Sloane was curating her masterpiece. If you looked at Sloane's social media, her life was a high-gloss magazine spread. She posted photos of Grant and the boys in matching flannel pajamas on Christmas morning. She posted videos of their vacations to Aspen and the Outer Banks, always with captions about blessings and making memories. She crafted an image of effortless perfection. I watched her do it. I watched her snap a photo of a home-cooked meal that she had actually ordered from a caterer and plated herself. I watched her force her sons to smile for a selfie, hissing at them through her teeth to look happy, only to caption it, "My joy." I knew it was a performance. We all knew, on some level, but I ignored the uncomfortable truth that lived in the shadow of her spotlight. Sloane's perfection wasn't self-sustaining. It was parasitic. For her to be the good sister, the successful mother, the stable wife, she needed a counterweight. She needed someone to be the mess. She needed someone to be the warning label. I was the designated failure. Every time she critiqued my parenting, she was reassuring herself that she was doing it right. Every time my parents sighed over my hard life, they were congratulating themselves on how well Sloane had turned out. I was the dark background that made her bright colors pop. They didn't want me to succeed. If I succeeded, if I was happy, solvent, and stable without a husband, then Sloane's narrative collapsed. If I was fine, then her constant anxiety about appearances became unnecessary. If Eli was thriving, then her pressure cooker parenting style looked abusive, not superior. I realized this fully only recently. I was looking at a photo she had posted of our last family gathering. In the picture, Sloane was glowing. Center stage. I was in the background, looking down at Eli, half out of the frame. The caption read, "Family is everything. Holding on to gratitude, even when things are hard for others." It was a subtle, public dig, tagged with prayers. That was the moment the sadness turned into something else. It turned into clarity. I had spent 4 years trying to prove I was worthy of their respect. I had spent 4 years trying to show them I was okay. But they didn't want me to be okay. They needed me to be broken. And as I sat at that dinner table, listening to Sloane tell the room that my son was a mess because he lacked a father, I felt the weight of that history pressing against my spine. I thought about the late nights. I thought about the therapy sessions where Eli cried because he missed his dad. I thought about the check I wrote every month for the college fund. I thought about the folder in my purse. The difference between Sloane and me wasn't that she was successful and I was struggling. The difference was that my struggle was honest, and her success was a lie. My sad little life was built on bedrock hard work, real grief, and absolute devotion to my child. Her perfect life was built on credit, deception, and the exploitation of a 10-year-old boy's identity. She had called us half a family. I looked at my son, who was staring at the tablecloth, trying to make himself small. He wasn't half a person. He was the whole world to me, and I was done letting these people treat him like a prop in their stage play. The flashback ended. The anger that had been simmering for 4 years finally reached a boil, but it didn't explode outward in a messy spray. It concentrated. It focused. It became a laser. I was not just fighting for the present moment. I was fighting for the widow who had been told she wasn't enough. I was fighting for the boy who had been told he was broken. I was fighting for the 4 years of silence I had endured in the name of peace. Peace was over. It was time for war. I am just trying to help. Kendall, Sloane said, lifting one shoulder in a shrug that was designed to look casual but felt practiced. She picked up her wine glass again, swirling the red liquid. It is constructive criticism. Someone has to be honest with you about Eli's development. If everyone just tiptoes around the issues because they are afraid of hurting your feelings, the boy never improves. I am doing you a favor. She looked around the table for validation, and she got it. My mother nodded sympathetically, and my father grunted his agreement. They really believed this. They believed that humiliating a 10-year-old at the dinner table was an act of benevolence. Constructive criticism, I repeated, tasting the words. They tasted like ash. Yes, Sloane said, smiling that tight, pitying smile. We are family. We are the only ones who will tell you the truth. The truth, I said softly. Okay, let's talk about the truth. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. I didn't slam it down. I didn't throw it. I placed it on the mahogany table with deliberate care. It landed flat, quiet, and final. The sound was soft, a mere whisper of paper against wood, but in the sudden silence of the room, it resonated like a gunshot. It was an alien object in this landscape of crystal and silver. A stark, beige rectangle of reality intruding on their carefully curated fantasy. The air in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The comfortable rhythm of the dinner, the chewing, the sipping, the polite nodding stalled. My mother, Janine, set her fork down. Her eyes darted from my face to the folder and back again. She knew that look in my eye. She hadn't seen it often, maybe not since I was a teenager, but she recognized the set of my jaw. Kendall, she warned, her voice low and vibrating with a threat disguised as a plea. Don't do this. We are having a nice dinner. Don't ruin it. I am not ruining anything, Mom, I said, my voice steady. I am just adding to the conversation about success and stability. That is what we are talking about, right? Sloane let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a brittle sound. What is that? She asked, gesturing vaguely at the folder with her free hand. A dramatic prop. Did you write a manifesto? Is this a list of grievances because I didn't like your potato salad last Thanksgiving? It is not a manifesto, I said. Then what is it? Grant asked. He was still smiling, but the smile had frozen. It no longer reached his eyes. He was looking at the folder with the wary intensity of a man who recognizes a subpoena when he sees one. I opened the folder. The metal clasp made a small snap that echoed in the quiet room. It is paperwork, I said. From work. Work, Ray scoffed. We are eating dinner. Kendall, put your work away. Nobody wants to hear about your bank regulations. I think you will want to hear about this, I said. I took the first sheet of paper from the stack. It was the mortgage delinquency notice. I turned it around so it faced Sloane and Grant, and I slid it across the polished wood until it rested just in front of the centerpiece. Do you want to explain your delinquency timeline? I asked. My tone was conversational, polite, as if I were asking for the salt. Because according to this, you haven't made a full mortgage payment in 4 months. Grant's smile cracked. It didn't just fade. It shattered. For a split second, his face went slack with genuine shock, the mask falling away to reveal a terrified, cornered man. He recognized the document format. He saw the Cedar Line logo in the corner. He saw the red bolded text that said, Notice of Default. He looked at Sloane. Sloane looked at the paper, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the text upside down, and then she looked at me. The color drained from her face, leaving her makeup standing out like paint on a mannequin. That is private, she hissed, reaching for the paper. Where did you get that? It came across my desk, I said, keeping my hand resting on the rest of the stack. 2 weeks ago, when you missed the third payment, you spied on us. Sloane's voice rose to a screech. You violated our privacy. I work in fraud prevention. Sloane, I said, I didn't have to spy. Your financial ruin flagged itself in my system. My father stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh, grating noise. His face was flushing a deep, angry red. That is enough, he bellowed. Kendall, you are out of line, bringing confidential papers to this table, disrespecting your sister and her husband like this. I won't have it. In the Graham family, truth was always labeled disrespect. Exposing a lie was considered more sinful than telling one. Sit down, Dad, I said. I didn't shout. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with a calmness that I didn't know I possessed. Do not tell me to sit down in my own house, he shouted, pointing a finger at me. You apologize to them right now, accusing them of whatever this is. I am not accusing them of anything, I said. I am showing you the documentation. Sloane lunged for the folder. Her hand shot across the table, her fingernails clicking against the wood. Don't, I said. I pulled the folder back, out of her reach. Just an inch. My movement was fast, sharp. Eli looked up. His eyes were wide, round as saucers. He was staring at me. He had never seen me like this. He had never seen me take up space in this room. He had never seen me disobey my father or challenge my sister. He looked frightened, but he also looked fascinated. Give me that, Sloane demanded, her voice trembling with rage and panic. You have no right. I have every right, I said. Because this isn't just about your mortgage. Sloane, I pulled the next sheet from the stack. The credit card statements, the circular transfers. You have been floating your lifestyle on credit for 6 months, I said, laying the papers out like tarot cards. Grant lost his job in June, didn't he? Grant flinched. He looked down at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He is consulting, Sloane stammered. He is building his own firm. It takes capital to start a business. He is unemployed, I corrected her. And instead of cutting back, instead of being honest, you have been burning through cash to keep up appearances, the country club, the cars, the vacations. We are handling it, Sloane screamed. It is a temporary cash flow issue. Everyone has them. It is not temporary, I said. You are insolvent. But I didn't bring this here to shame you for being broke. I brought it because of what you did next. I looked at Grant. Tell them, Grant, tell them how you tried to fix the cash flow issue last week. Grant didn't speak. He just shook his head slightly, staring at the linen napkin in his lap. What is she talking about? Janine asked, her voice wavering. She looked from Grant to Sloane, fear creeping into her expression. Sloane, what is she talking about? Nothing, Sloane insisted. She is crazy. She is jealous. She has always been jealous of us. Mom, you know that? She is making things up to make herself feel better about her miserable life. I am not making this up, I said. I pulled out the final document, the credit application. This is an application for a $50,000 line of credit, I said, my voice dropping to a register that was ice cold. It was submitted 3 days ago. The applicant is listed as Grant Miller. So, Sloane spat. Grant applied for a loan. So what? The Social Security number on the application, I said, looking directly into Sloane's eyes, does not belong to Grant. Sloane stopped breathing. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Whose number is it? Ray demanded, though the bluster was leaking out of him. He looked confused, sensing that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. It belongs to Eli, I said. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. Even the grandfather clock seemed to stop ticking. Eli blinked. Me, he whispered. I turned to my son, softening my face for just a second. Yes, honey, they used your number. Then I turned back to Sloane. The look on her face was pure terror. She knew exactly what I was holding. That has to be a mistake, Janine whispered. Sloane would never, Grant would never. It is not a mistake, I said. It is synthetic identity fraud. It is a federal crime, and it was done from an IP address inside this house. Sloane started to shake. Her hands, resting on the table, were trembling so violently that her fork rattled against her plate. We didn't mean, she started, her voice a broken croak. We were going to pay it back. It was just a bridge loan. We just needed a clean file to get the approval. You used my son, I said. We were going to pay it back, Sloane screamed, tears suddenly bursting from her eyes. You don't understand the pressure. Kendall, you don't understand what it costs to live like this. We had to. We were going to lose the house. So you decided to steal my 10-year-old son's credit? I asked. You decided to ruin his financial future before he even hits puberty, so you could keep your country club membership. I didn't ruin anything, Sloane sobbed. We would have fixed it. You don't get to say that, I said. I stood up. I leaned over the table, placing my hands flat on the wood, looking down at my sister who was now shrinking into her chair, a weeping, terrified mess. You sat here tonight, I said, my voice ringing clear and hard in the room. You sat here and you smirked at me. You told me my son was a mess. You told me I was a failure. You lectured me about stability and success. I pointed at the papers spread out between the roast beef and the green beans. You don't get to call my son a mess while your life is balanced on a lie. I said, you don't get to judge my parenting while you are committing felonies against my child. Sloane looked up at me, mascara running down her cheeks. Her perfect mask dissolved into a grotesque portrait of guilt. Grant was weeping silently, his head in his hands. My parents were frozen, staring at the wreckage of their favorite story. I am done, I said. I am done with the lectures. I am done with the insults. And I am done with you using us to make yourself feel big. I reached out and gathered the papers, tapping them into a neat stack. I put them back in the folder and closed the clasp. Now, I said, looking at Grant, we are going to talk about how you are going to fix this, and we are going to do it on my terms. The silence in the dining room was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and thick with the dust of crumbling facades. I stood at the head of the table, not physically, but energetically. For the first time in my life, the gravity of the room was centered on me, not on my sister's theatrics or my father's bluster. I looked at the documents spread out on the linen tablecloth, appearing like an autopsy of their perfect life. Let's be very clear about what we are looking at, I said, my voice stripping away the emotion to leave only the jagged edges of the facts. This is not just about missing a few payments because things got tight. This is a systemic, calculated effort to manufacture money out of thin air. I pointed to the document on the far left, a home equity line of credit agreement from a bank that was not Cedar Line, but one whose records I could access through our interbank fraud alert network. You opened this HELOC 4 months ago, I stated, looking at Grant. You withdrew $80,000 against the equity in this house. On the application, you listed your income as verified through Miller Consulting Group. You claimed a monthly revenue of $12,000. Grant flinched, his eyes darting to my father, then to the floor. There is no Miller Consulting Group, I continued, answering the question before anyone could ask it. I ran the business license search. It does not exist. It is a shell. You created a fake employer to verify your own income so you could borrow money you had no way of paying back. We were going to launch it, Sloane interjected, her voice shrill and desperate. It was a projection. Business plans use projections all the time. Kendall, you wouldn't understand entrepreneurial finance. I understand fraud, I countered calmly. And in the banking world, listing projected income as current verified income is called lying on a loan application. It is a felony. I turned my gaze to Grant. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The broad-shouldered, confident man who liked to give unsolicited career advice was gone. In his place was a terrified man in an expensive sweater. You lost your job in June, I said. It wasn't a question. My mother gasped. June, but Grant said he resigned to pursue other opportunities. He said he was headhunted. He was fired, I said. For cause? There was an internal audit at his logistics firm. I didn't pull those records. Grant, because I didn't have to. The gap in your direct deposits told the whole story. You haven't had a legitimate paycheck in 6 months. Grant closed his eyes. He didn't deny it. The shame radiating off him was palpable. Sloane knew, I said, turning to my sister. She knew the money stopped coming in, but instead of downsizing, instead of selling the cars or cutting back on the country club, she made you hide it. She couldn't survive the honesty. She couldn't handle the idea of Westbriar knowing that the golden couple was struggling, so she became the architect of this disaster. I was protecting his dignity, Sloane snapped, though her defiance was wavering. I was supporting my husband. You were floating bills, I corrected her. I tracked the transfers. You used the cash from the home equity line to pay the mortgage for 2 months. Then, when that ran low, you maxed out the credit cards. Then, you opened new cards in Grant's name to transfer the balances. It is called kiting. You are moving debt around in a circle, trying to outrun the interest rates, but the music stopped, didn't it? You ran out of credit. You ran out of equity. You ran out of places to hide. I paused, letting the reality sink in. My father was staring at Grant with a mixture of horror and betrayal. He had always respected Grant's earning power more than Grant's character, and now that the earning power was revealed to be a mirage, the respect was evaporating. But that is just money, I said, my voice dropping lower, becoming harder. People go broke. People make bad decisions. If it stopped there, I would have just been angry, but it didn't stop there. I tapped the final document, the one with the red warning box. You needed a new line of credit, I said. Desperately, you had bills coming due that were going to expose you. But Grant's credit score had tanked because of the utilization rate. You couldn't get approved for a stick of gum, let alone $50,000. I looked at Sloane. She was gripping her wineglass so hard I thought the stem might snap. So you looked for a clean history, I said. You looked for someone with no debt, no bad marks, someone who wouldn't notice a credit inquiry because they are 10 years old. That is impossible, Sloane said. She said it too fast. She said it with the mechanical reflex of a liar who has rehearsed the denial in the mirror. We would never do that. It must be a glitch, a computer error. You said yourself. Systems make mistakes. The system creates a log. Sloane, I said. I saw the application. It was submitted online from a device with an IP address registered to this house. The applicant's name was listed as Grant Miller, but the social security number entered was Eli's, and the birth date. You changed the birth year just enough to bypass the immediate age filter, but you kept the month and day, Eli's birthday, October 14th. I watched Grant. I needed to see this. I needed to know the depth of the rot. Grant's head snapped up. He looked at the paper under my hand. Then he turned his head slowly to look at his wife. His expression wasn't fear anymore. It was confusion, bleeding into horror. Sloane, Grant said. His voice was hoarse. You told me you used a guarantor. The room went deadly silent. Sloane froze. She looked at Grant, her eyes wide, realizing she had been caught in a crossfire between my evidence and her own lies to her husband. You told me your father co-signed, Grant said, his voice rising in disbelief. You told me Ray signed off on the bridge loan so we could get through the quarter. You said you handled the paperwork so I wouldn't have to ask him myself. Grant looked at my father. Ray, did you sign for us? My father shook his head slowly, his mouth hanging slightly open. I didn't sign anything, Sloane asked, but I told her no. I told her I don't lend money to family. Grant turned back to Sloane. He looked like he was seeing a stranger. He looked like he was realizing that the woman sitting next to him was not just a social climber, but something far more dangerous. You used the boy, Grant whispered. Sloane, tell me you didn't use the boy's number. I fixed it. Sloane stammered, her voice pitching up into hysteria. I just needed the approval code. I was going to swap it out later. I was going to pay it back before anyone noticed. It was just numbers. Grant, it was just data. It is my son. I slammed my hand on the table. The silver jumped. It is not data. It is his identity. Do you know what happens to a child with a compromised credit file? Do you know how hard it is to clean that up? He could be 20 years old and getting denied for student loans because you wanted to pay for a ski trip. I didn't mean to hurt him, Sloane cried. I was desperate. You don't understand. I don't care, I said cold and sharp. My mother, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly found her voice. She stood up, her hands fluttering nervously. Okay. Everyone calm down, Janine said. She moved toward Sloane, instinctively placing a hand on her shoulder. Sloane made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but she is under a lot of pressure. We can fix this. We can pay it back. I will write a check. Ray, get the checkbook. We will pay off the loan, and we will make it go away. I looked at my mother with a profound sense of disappointment. It wasn't surprising, but it still hurt. Even now, facing a felony, her instinct was to cover for Sloane. Her religion was the preservation of Sloane's image. You cannot write a check to fix this. Mom, I said, this isn't a library fine. The application was flagged for fraud. It is in the system. The bank's algorithm has already identified it as a synthetic identity attempt. Well, you work there, Janine pleaded, her eyes begging me to be the doormat one last time. You can delete it. You can tell them it was an error. Just make it go away. Kendall, for the family. We cannot let people know about this. Think of Sloane's reputation. Think of the boys. Think of the boys. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You mean Sloane's boys? Because nobody in this room seems to be thinking about my boy. Nobody thought about Eli when they typed his social security number into a loan application. We are thinking about him, Janine insisted. We are trying to keep his aunt out of trouble. That helps him, doesn't it? No, I said. It doesn't. I looked at Sloane. Her smirk was gone. It had been wiped from her face as completely as if it had never existed. Her hands were shaking violently now, her knuckles white. The dessert on the table, a raspberry tart she had likely bought and claimed she baked, sat untouched. It looked ridiculous, a frivolous garnish on a plate of disaster. Here is the reality, I said, addressing the room with the clinical detachment of a judge. This has already triggered a review because I am related to the parties involved. I cannot touch the file. If I try to delete it or alter it, I go to jail too. That is how compliance works. Sloane whimpered. If this escalates, I continued, it becomes a police matter. Identity theft involving a minor is an aggravating factor. The prosecutors don't like it. If they pursue this, Sloane, you are looking at mandatory restitution, probation, and potentially prison time, and it becomes public record. The West Briar Gazette will run the mugshot. Everyone at the club will know. Sloane put her head down on the table and began to sob. It was a messy, ugly sound. However, I said, there is a narrow window where this can be contained as an internal banking matter, if the application is withdrawn immediately, and if the fraud is admitted to by the applicant before the investigation fully launches. The bank sometimes chooses to simply blacklist the customer rather than prosecute, to save legal fees. Grant looked up at me. What do we have to do? Not we, I said. Her? You didn't sign it. Grant, I saw the digital signature timestamps. It was Sloane. I leaned in, my voice lowering to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. My priority right now isn't revenge, I said. I don't care about your reputation, and I don't care about your social standing. My priority is making sure my child is never used as currency again. I am here to build a wall around Eli that you will never be able to breach. I looked at my parents. And you, I said to them, you are going to stop asking me to fix her messes, because this time, the mess is a crime scene. I picked up the folder. I didn't need to leave it with them. I had the copies. I had the leverage. Dessert is over, I said. Grant, I suggest you go home and check your own credit report. I have a feeling Eli wasn't the only one she leveraged. I took Eli's hand. He had been watching the entire exchange with wide, intelligent eyes. He stood up immediately, ready to leave. He didn't say goodbye to his grandparents. He didn't look at his aunt. He just held my hand, tight. Let's go. Eli, I said. We walked out of the dining room, leaving the wreckage of the dinner behind us. The silence we left in our wake was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a bomb that had finally gone off. I had one hand on the doorknob, my fingers gripping the cool metal, ready to turn it and walk out of that house forever. Eli was standing close to my hip, his small body tense, waiting for my signal. The air in the dining room behind us was thick with the fallout of the explosion I had just detonated. I could hear Sloane's jagged breathing, the sound of a woman who had been stripped of her defenses and left naked in the cold light of her own choices. But there was one last thing that needed to be said, one final layer of the narrative that needed to be peeled back before I could leave them to their wreckage. Sloane lifted her head from her hands. Her face was a ruin of smeared mascara and blotchy skin. She looked at me not with remorse, but with a sudden, sharp flash of hatred. Even in defeat, she needed to be the victim. She needed to make me the villain. "You enjoyed this," she choked out, her voice thick with phlegm and spite. "You have been waiting for this. You probably watched us struggle for months, laughing in your sad little condo. You wanted to see us drown." I stopped. I didn't open the door. I turned back slowly, facing the room one last time. The accusation hung in the air, grotesque and unfair, but entirely predictable. In Sloane's world, people were only motivated by envy or malice. She could not conceive of a universe where I acted out of anything other than bitterness. "You think I wanted you to fail?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Of course you did," she spat. "You hate that I have a husband. You hate that I have the big house. You have been jealous of me since we were 12. You saw the flags in your system, and you let us bleed just so you could have this moment." My father, Ray, looked up, seizing on this new angle. It was a lifeline for him, a way to vilify me and salvage his worldview. "Is that true, Kendall?" he asked, his voice hardening. "Did you sit on this information? Did you let your sister spiral just to make a point? Because if you did, that is cruel. That is cold-blooded." I looked at them. I looked at the parents who had called me a mess, and the sister who had called me a failure, and I felt a profound, aching sadness, not for myself, but for how little they actually knew me. "I didn't watch you drown, Sloane," I said. "I was the one holding your head above water." Sloane frowned, confusion cutting through her hysteria. "What?" "The Citibank card," I said. "The one you use for groceries and the boys' tuition deposits, the one that was 2 months behind in August." Sloane's eyes widened. She knew exactly which card I was talking about. "It was about to go to collections," I continued. "You were getting calls. I know because I saw the notes in the credit file history, and then, suddenly, 3 anonymous payments were made. $300 in September, $400 in October, $500 in November, just enough to keep the account current, just enough to stop the collections calls." Sloane's mouth opened slightly. She stared at me, her brain trying to compute the impossibility of what I was saying. "I made those payments," I said. The room went silent again. But this was a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of shock. It was the silence of confusion. It was the sound of a paradigm shifting, grinding gears as it tried to accommodate a truth that didn't fit. "You?" Grant asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You paid our credit card bill." "Yes," I said. "But—" My mother, Janine, shook her head, looking at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. "But you struggle. Kendall, we always help you. We buy Eli his school clothes. How could you have money to pay Sloane's bills?" "I don't struggle, Mom," I said, feeling the exhaustion of years of being misunderstood washing over me. "I have never struggled. I live within my means. I save. I budget. The money you give Eli for clothes goes into his savings account because I have already bought him what he needs. I let you do it because it makes you feel like good grandparents. But I didn't need it, and I certainly didn't need to see my nephews lose their stability." "Why?" Sloane whispered. She didn't say thank you. She looked at me with suspicion, as if I had weaponized generosity, as if my charity was a trick. "Why would you do that? You never said anything." Because I know what it feels like to have the ground fall out from under you, I said. When Logan died, the financial fear was almost as bad as the grief. I woke up every night wondering if we would lose the condo. I didn't want your boys to feel that. I didn't want Connor and Liam to hear you arguing about money. I didn't want them to be uprooted. I took a step closer to the table, my eyes locking with Sloane's. I did it because, despite everything, you are my sister, I said. I thought I hoped that if I helped you, even secretly, it might put some good energy back into this family. I thought maybe if the pressure was off you just a little bit, you might be kinder. I thought maybe if I was there for you, even if you didn't know it, we could eventually repair things. It was the most vulnerable admission I had ever made to them. I was admitting that I had craved their love enough to pay for it. I was admitting that I had been buying peace on an installment plan. Eli looked up at me. He squeezed my hand, hard. He was watching his mother, the woman who had always told him to be quiet, standing tall and speaking with a quiet power he had never witnessed. He was learning, in real time, that compassion was not weakness. He was learning that you could be kind without being a doormat. You paid them, my father muttered, rubbing his forehead. He looked disoriented. You paid the bills. He couldn't reconcile it. In his story, I was the one who needed saving. If I was the savior, then who was he? If I was the strong one, then what was Sloane? I did, I said. But I stopped. Sloane flinched. I made the last payment in November, I said, and I was going to make another one this week. I had the transfer set up. I was going to pay the minimum on your overdue Nordstrom account because I knew you would want to buy Christmas presents. But you didn't, Sloane said, her voice trembling. No, I said. I canceled it. Do you know why? Because you found out about the fraud, Grant said, his head hanging low. Yes, I said. But it is more than that. I looked at my sister, feeling the final severance of the cord that had bound us for decades. I was willing to help you when you were drowning, I said. I was willing to help you when you were irresponsible. I was even willing to tolerate your insults at dinner because I thought you were just stressed. I paused, letting the words gather weight. But the moment you used my son's name, I said, my voice dropping to a register of absolute steel, the moment you decided to drag my child into your mess to save your own skin, that was it. The moment a child's name touches your scheme, kindness becomes negligence. I told you, Sloane cried. I was going to fix it. It doesn't matter. I cut her off. You stole from him. You stole from a 10-year-old boy who has already lost his father. You looked at his future and decided it was less important than your reputation. And for me to continue helping you after that, that would be betraying him. That would be telling him that his safety matters less than your comfort, and I will never do that. You are being so dramatic, my mother sighed, falling back into her default setting. She waved her hand as if shooing away a fly. Sloane made a mistake, yes, but throwing it in her face like this, withholding help, it is vindictive. Kendall, it is not like you. It is cold, my father added, nodding. He looked at me with a strange mixture of fear and disdain. Family helps family. If you had the money, you should have just given it to her. You shouldn't have made a game out of it. And cutting her off now, when she is down, that is cold. Kendall, that is ice cold. I laughed. I actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that startled them. You call it cold, I said. I call it a boundary. I looked at my mother, then at my father. You have spent my entire life telling me I am too sensitive, I said. You told me I was too emotional. You told me I needed to be tougher. Well, here it is. This is tough. This is what strength actually looks like. It looks like cruelty, my mother sniffed, reaching for her wine glass with a shaking hand. No, Mom, I said. You confuse boundaries with cruelty because you benefit from my silence. You think me allowing you to walk all over me is love. You think me cleaning up your messes is loyalty. But it is not. It is enablement. And I am done enabling this family to hurt my son. I looked at Grant. You have 24 hours to withdraw that application and provide me with written proof from the bank that it has been canceled as an error. If I don't see that proof by 5 o'clock tomorrow, I file the formal fraud report." "We will do it," Grant said quickly. "I promise." "And Sloan," I said. My sister looked up. She looked small. She looked diminished. "You are going to apologize to Eli," I said. "Not now. Not when you are hysterical and trying to save face. You are going to write him a letter, a real apology, and until I see that letter, and until I feel like you actually understand what you did, you are not going to see him. You are not going to see me. There will be no Christmas dinner. There will be no birthdays. You cannot keep my grandchildren from me," my mother gasped. "Watch me," I said. "That is my nephew," Sloan cried. "You cannot just cut us out." "I am not cutting you out," I said, tightening my grip on the doorknob. "I am protecting him. There is a difference. And if you cannot see that, then that is just another reason why you don't get access to him." I opened the door. The cold night air rushed in, crisp and clean, smelling of rain and wet leaves. It smelled like freedom. "Come on, Eli," I said. We walked out onto the porch, behind us. The dining room was silent. For the first time in 30 years, they had no script, they had no comeback. They had no way to spin this to make me the villain and themselves the heroes. The truth was too heavy, too documented, and too real. I closed the front door behind us. The latch clicked shut with a solid, satisfying sound. We walked down the brick path to my car, the sensible sedan they all despised. It looked beautiful under the streetlights. "Mom," Eli asked quietly as I unlocked the car. "Yeah, Bud?" I asked, opening the back door for him. "Did you really pay their bills?" he asked. I looked at him. I wasn't going to lie to him. "Yes, I did." "Why?" he asked. "Because they are family," I said. "And because I wanted to be kind." "But you stopped," he said. "Yes," I said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "I stopped." "Because they were mean?" he asked. "No," I said, looking into his eyes. "Because being kind to them meant being mean to you, and nobody gets to be mean to you, not on my watch." Eli nodded. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. He climbed into the car and buckled his seatbelt. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. As I pulled away from the curb, I looked in the rearview mirror. The house on the hill shrank into the distance, glowing with its expensive lights, holding its dark secrets. I didn't feel sad anymore. I felt lighter than air. I had spent a lifetime trying to earn a seat at their table, only to realize that the only table that mattered was the one I built myself. I thought the silence I had created was a wall they could not breach. I thought that by revealing the secret payments, the thousands of dollars I had quietly funneled into their failing accounts, I had stripped them of their ability to villainize me. I thought the logic of my kindness, and the boundary I had finally drawn, would be the end of the conversation. I was wrong. I had forgotten the most dangerous law of the Graham family dynamic when you corner a narcissist with the truth. They do not reflect, they detonate. My father, Ray, was the first to explode. The shock on his face curdled instantly into a familiar, jagged rage. He did not look at the fraud his daughter had committed. He looked at the breach of protocol I had committed by exposing it. To him, the crime wasn't the theft of a child's identity. The crime was the disruption of his dinner. "You vindictive little," he started, his voice a low rumble that shook the crystal glasses. He slammed his hand onto the table, right next to the folder I had closed. "You sat there. You sat there for 2 weeks with this information. You held on to it just to ambush your sister." "I held on to it to verify it," I said calmly, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "You humiliated her," he shouted, his face turning a mottled purple. "You brought work into the family. You used your access, your little bank job, to spy on your own blood. Is this what you do? You stockpile ammunition so you can feel superior. She stole my son's social security number. Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his volume like a razor. This isn't about my job. It is about her felony. It is a misunderstanding, he roared, waving his hand as if to physically erase the word felony from the air. It is a family matter, but you had to make it official. You had to print it out. You had to bring it here like a prosecutor. It is sick, Kendall. It is twisted. Before I could respond, Sloane wiped her face. The tears that had been flowing a moment ago stopped abruptly, replaced by a look of icy, calculated victimhood. She realized that begging hadn't worked, so she flipped the switch to the tactic that had served her since childhood, aggressive defensiveness. "So that is it," she sneered, her voice trembling with a weaponized fragility. "You are going to destroy my kid's future over one comment. That is what this is about, isn't it? I said Eli was a mess, and you decided to burn my life down." "I am not burning your life down," I said. "You lit the match when you typed in those numbers." "It was one comment," she shrieked, standing up to match my height. "One comment about your parenting, and you decide to send me to jail. You decide to leave my children without a mother who does that. What kind of monster does that to her sister?" "I am not doing it to you," I repeated, gripping the back of my chair. "You did it to yourself." "Kendall, please." My mother, Janine, interjected. Her voice was thin and reedy, the sound of a woman desperately trying to pull the curtains closed on a burning building. She reached out, trying to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "Be the bigger person. You know how Sloane gets when she is stressed. You know she didn't mean to hurt Eli. She was just borrowing. She was desperate. Can't you just let it go for the sake of the family?" "Be the bigger person," I echoed, the phrase tasting like bile. "You want me to be the bigger person while she commits identity theft against my 10-year-old. Do you hear yourself, Mom?" "We can fix it," she pleaded. "We can make it right. Just don't take it further." Then Grant spoke. He had been sitting with his head in his hands, but now he looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a glimmer of shared reality. I thought he was going to apologize. "Can you make this go away?" he asked. I stared at him. He didn't ask, "Is Eli okay?" He didn't ask, "How did this affect his credit?" He didn't ask, "How can I earn your forgiveness?" He asked if I could delete the crime. "Grant," I said, my voice flat, "it is in the system." "But you have override codes," he pressed, leaning forward, his desperation making him look ugly. "You are a senior analyst. You can flag it as a system error. You can scrub the inquiry. If you do that, the investigation stops before it starts. Nobody has to know." I looked around the table at the four of them. My father, furious that I had broken the rules of silence. My mother, begging me to absorb the pain so Sloane didn't have to. Sloane, acting as if I were the aggressor for catching her. And Grant, looking for a technical loophole to save his skin. And I realized, with a clarity that was both liberating and devastating, exactly who I was to them. I wasn't a daughter. I wasn't a sister. I wasn't a person with feelings or rights. I was the fixer. I was the payer. I was the sponge designed to soak up their bad behavior so they could stay dry. I was the resource they mined when they needed money or silence, and the punching bag they used when they needed to feel superior. "I won't do it," I said. "I won't go to prison for you." Sloane's eyes narrowed. She saw that the guilt hadn't worked. She saw that the bullying hadn't worked, so she reached for the nuclear option. She reached for the one thing she knew mattered to me more than the law, more than my job, more than my dignity. She straightened her spine, smoothed her hair, and looked at me with a terrifying calmness. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that was infinitely more menacing than her screaming. "I have been worried about you. Kendall, we all have. You have been so unstable since Logan died." "I am not unstable," I said, wary of the shift. "Are you?" she asked, tilting her head. "You work all the time. You drag Eli to that tiny condo. You isolate him. And now this paranoia, this aggressive outburst at a family dinner, it really paints a picture." What are you doing, Sloane? I asked. I have been talking to a friend of mine, she said casually, picking at a loose thread on the tablecloth. Miranda, you know her. She is a family law attorney. We were talking just the other day about what is best for Eli, about how boys without fathers really need a strong, two-parent household to thrive. The room chilled. The temperature didn't just drop. It plummeted. I mentioned how overwhelmed you seem, Sloane continued, her eyes locking onto mine. How you are barely keeping it together, and Miranda said that in cases where the mother is emotionally compromised, the courts often look for the most stable environment for the child, an environment with a mother and a father, with resources, with a yard. My blood ran cold. She wasn't just insulting me anymore. She was threatening me. She was hinting that she had laid the groundwork to take my son. You wouldn't, I whispered. I just want what is best for my nephew, she said, a cruel smile touching her lips. If you are going to try to ruin our lives with these legal technicalities, Kendall, maybe we need to look at the whole picture. Maybe we need to call Child Protective Services and have them do a wellness check. Maybe we need to see if a judge thinks a vindictive, overworked widow is really the best guardian for a vulnerable boy. I looked at my parents. They weren't stopping her. My father was watching with a grim satisfaction, as if thinking, finally, someone is putting her in her place. My mother looked down, refusing to meet my eye. Her silence a tacit endorsement. This was the plan. This was the long game behind years of judgment. They didn't just call Eli a mess to be mean. They were building a case. They were labeling me unstable and labeling Eli damaged so that if they ever decided they wanted him, or if they ever needed to control me, they had the narrative ready. They wanted to crown Sloane as the stable option, the savior who would rescue the poor, fatherless boy from his bitter mother. They were using my son as leverage to force me to cover up their fraud. Under the table, a small hand found mine. Eli's fingers wrapped around my palm. They were shaking, but his grip was tight. I looked down at him. He wasn't looking at the tablecloth anymore. He was looking at Sloane, and there was no confusion in his eyes. He understood. He knew that his aunt was threatening to take him away from me. I felt his fear, but I also felt his trust. He was holding on to me because he knew I was the only thing standing between him and them. And that touch, that small, terrified, trusting grip snapped something inside me. It broke the last chain of obligation I felt toward these people. I was done suffering in private to keep the public peace. I was done being the bigger person. I squeezed Eli's hand back, hard, letting him know I had him. Then I looked up at Sloane. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I looked at her with the absolute, terrifying calm of a mother who has spotted a predator near her young. Okay, I said. Sloane blinked, confused by my lack of panic. Okay. You want to talk about courts? I asked. I stood up, pulling Eli up with me. I towered over the table. Let's talk about courts. If you want to play custody games, I said, my voice ringing with a deadly precision. Let's talk about what family courts do with fraud. Sloane's smile faltered. You think a judge is going to give custody to a woman who is currently under investigation for synthetic identity theft involving a minor? I asked, leaning in. You think Child Protective Services looks kindly on an aunt who stole her nephew's social security number to pay for a country club membership? I laughed, a harsh sound. You have no leverage. Sloane, you have a felony. And if you even whisper the word custody again, if you ever threaten my relationship with my son, I will make sure the prosecutor adds aggravated circumstances to the charge. I will make sure you don't just lose your house. I will make sure you lose your freedom. I looked at Grant. And you? Grant, you think you can provide a stable environment. You are unemployed and complicit in financial crimes. The court would laugh you out of the building. I turned to my parents. And you too, I said, pointing a finger at them. You think you can bankroll their legal fight with what I know your retirement accounts are drained because you have been secretly bailing them out for years too. I saw those transfers in the system. My father's jaw dropped. I see everything, I said. I am the one who knows where the money went. So do not threaten me. Do not come after my son." I pulled Eli close to my side. "We are leaving," I said. "And if any of you try to contact us before I get that confirmation that the application has been withdrawn, the next person you speak to will be the FBI." Sloan opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The threat of taking Eli had been her ace in the hole, and I had just shown her that she was holding a handful of ash. I turned my back on them. I walked my son out of the dining room, past the perfectly set table, past the untouched dessert, and into the foyer. I didn't look back. I didn't care if they were crying. I didn't care if they were shouting. All I cared about was the small hand in mine, and the fact that for the first time in 10 years, we were walking toward a future that they couldn't touch. The drive home from my parents' house was quiet, but it was not peaceful. My phone, which I had tossed onto the passenger seat, vibrated against the leather upholstery like a trapped insect. It buzzed every 30 seconds, lighting up the dark interior of the car with flashes of names I used to associate with safety, but now associated with danger. Mom sent texts that started with "please" and ended with "family." Dad sent texts that were short, capitalized commands demanding I answer. Sloan sent a barrage of messages that oscillated between begging and threatening, a digital reflection of the spiral she was currently riding down to the bottom. I did not touch the phone. I kept my hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road. Beside me, Eli had fallen asleep, his head resting against the cool glass of the window. In the passing streetlights, his face looked young and unburdened for the first time in years. I realized then that my silence had not been protecting him. It had been exposing him. By keeping the peace, I had allowed them to wage a cold war against his self-esteem. We got home, and I turned my phone off completely. I made us hot chocolate, not because it was a special occasion, but because we had survived. We drank it in the living room with only the lamp on, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, enjoying the absence of judgment. The next morning, Monday, I walked into the Cedar Line Financial Group Tower at 8 o'clock sharp. I was not wearing my usual cardigan and slacks. I wore my charcoal suit, the one I saved for board meetings and external audits. I felt like a soldier putting on armor. I sat at my desk, logged into the secure terminal, and did the one thing my family was betting I would never do. I formalized it. I opened a new case file. I typed in the incident report. I detailed the unauthorized credit inquiry, the mismatched personal identifying information, and the familial relationship between the applicant and the victim. I attached the digital logs I had printed 2 weeks ago. I hovered my finger over the submit button. I knew what this meant. Once I clicked that button, the clock started. The internal fraud unit would pick it up within 4 hours. The automated letters would go out. The investigation would move from a personal secret to a corporate procedure. There would be no taking it back. There would be no fixing it over Sunday dinner. I thought about Sloane's smirk. I thought about her threatening to call Child Protective Services. I thought about Eli's hand trembling in mine. I clicked submit. The screen flashed a green confirmation banner, incident report filed, case number 4922 Alpha. I felt a wave of nausea, followed immediately by a rush of cold. Clean relief. I had stopped being the keeper of their secrets. I was just an analyst doing her job. Sloan could charm my mother. She could manipulate Grant. She could bully my father, but she could not charm an algorithm. She could not gaslight a fraud detection system that ran on binary code and federal statutes. By noon, the machinery was in motion. I saw the ticket move from pending to active review in the queue, assigned to an investigator named Patterson in the Chicago office. I didn't know Patterson, which was perfect. He wouldn't care that Sloan was the president of the West Briar Garden Club. He would only care that she had committed a crime. On Tuesday, Grant called me. I almost let it go to voicemail, but I was curious. I answered on the second ring, keeping my voice professional. "This is Kendall." "Kendall." His voice sounded like dry leaves being crushed under a boot. It was cracked, hollow, and devoid of the slick salesman energy he usually projected. "It is Grant." "I know who it is, Grant," I said. "I am at work." "I know," he said. I needed to ask, did you do it?" Did you file the report? Yes, I said. I heard him exhale, a long, shuddering breath that sounded like a tire losing air. She told me she handled the paperwork, he said, the words spilling out of him in a rush. Kendall, you have to believe me. I knew we were in trouble. I knew we were moving money around, but I didn't know she used the boy. I swear on my life. She brought me the papers to sign, and she kept her hand over the top part. She said it was just a formality. She said your dad had agreed to co-sign but didn't want to make a big deal out of it. You signed a document without reading it. Grant, I said, feeling a flicker of pity but stamping it out. You are 42 years old. You don't get to play dumb. I trusted her, he cried, his voice breaking. She is my wife. She has always handled the finances. She said she was protecting me from the stress so I could focus on finding a job. I thought she was being supportive. I didn't know she was building a house of cards. The house has fallen, Grant, I said, and you are standing in the rubble. She is lying to everyone, he whispered. She is telling her friends that there was a banking error. She is telling your parents that you are having a mental breakdown and attacking us. But I looked at the credit report like you said. I saw the inquiry. I saw the date. And I asked, and I saw 3 other inquiries, he said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. From banks I have never heard of. She didn't just try once. Kendall, she has been shopping for credit using different numbers. I think she tried to use your dad's number too. I closed my eyes. It was worse than I thought. It wasn't a one-time act of desperation. It was a pattern. Sloan was a financial predator. You need a lawyer, Grant, I said. Not a divorce lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer. And you need to get your name off everything she touches. I don't know what to do, he wept. Everything I thought we had it is all fake. The equity is gone. The savings are gone. We are negative. Kendall, we are drowning. I know, I said. I tried to tell you. I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sick. The perfect life they had beaten me over the head with for 4 years was nothing but a hologram projected over a sinkhole. My parents were the next wave. They didn't call. They showed up at my condo on Wednesday evening. I saw them through the peephole. My father looked furious. My mother looked haggard. I told Eli to go into his room and put on his headphones. I didn't want him to hear this. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. I stood in the threshold, using the doorframe as a shield. You filed it, my father spat, skipping the hello. Sloan got a letter from the bank today. Her account is frozen. They are asking for identity verification. Do you know what you have done? I protected my son, I said. You destroyed your sister, he shouted. Over money, we could have paid you back. Kendall, I told you I would write a check. It is not about the money, Dad, I said, my voice weary. It is about the law, and it is about the fact that you still, even right now, haven't asked how Eli is. Eli is fine, my mother cried, wringing her hands. He is a child. He doesn't know about credit scores. You are making him a victim when he doesn't have to be one. He is a victim because his aunt stole his identity. I said, We will give you $10,000, my father said suddenly. I stared at him. What? $10,000, he repeated, reaching for his checkbook in his jacket pocket. Cash, right now. You call the bank. You tell them it was a misunderstanding. You tell them you gave permission and just forgot. You withdraw the report. I looked at the checkbook in his hand. It was shaking. I realized then that they were terrified. They weren't just protecting Sloan. They were protecting their own image. If Sloan went down, the shame would splash onto them. They would be the parents of a felon. You are trying to bribe me, I asked, my voice incredulous. To cover up a crime against your grandson. It is a gift, my mother pleaded, to help with Eli's school, to help with the condo. Just please, Kendall, fix this. Be the good one. You are always the good one. I am not the good one, I said, stepping back and starting to close the door. I am the honest one, and your money is no good here. If you close this door, my father threatened, pointing a finger at my face, Don't bother coming to Christmas. Don't bother calling us. I won't, I said. I shut the door. I locked the deadbolt. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and breathed. I had just orphaned myself. But strangely, I felt safer than I had in years. Then came the light. On Thursday, Eli came home from school with a thick cream-colored envelope. He walked into the kitchen where I was making dinner, his face pale. "Mom," he said. The letter came. My heart stopped. We had applied to the Piedmont Conservatory's Arts and Academics program 3 months ago. It was the most prestigious program in the state. They only took 20 students a year. Sloan had laughed when I told her we applied, saying, "Oh, honey, those programs are for prodigies. Don't get his hopes up." I wiped my hands on a towel. "Open it." Eli's hands shook as he tore the flap. He pulled out a heavy sheet of paper. He read the first line. Then he dropped the paper and looked at me, his eyes filling with tears. "I got in," he whispered. I grabbed the letter. "Dear Eli," it read, "we are pleased to inform you of your acceptance awarded the Jonathan Larson Scholarship for Resilience in the Arts, covering full tuition for the 4-year program." I scanned down to the handwritten note at the bottom from the dean. "Your essay on finding music within the silence of grief was one of the most moving pieces I have read in 20 years. You have a profound strength, young man." I dropped to my knees and pulled my son into a hug that squeezed the breath out of both of us. We cried in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of onions and garlic. The irony was so sharp it cut. My family had called him a mess. They had called him weak. They had said he needed a father to be strong. But Eli had built a spine out of loss. He had taken the silence they forced on him and turned it into music. He wasn't broken. He was forged. And he had done it without their money, without their connections, and without their approval. While we celebrated, Sloane's world began to dissolve. I heard about it through the grapevine, small drips of information that reached me even in my isolation. I ran into an old friend at the grocery store who asked, in a hushed tone, why Sloane hadn't been at the charity gala on Friday. Sloane never missed the gala. She was the chairwoman. "I heard she resigned," the friend whispered. "Something about a family emergency. But then I saw Grant at the gas station, and he looked well. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week." The masks were slipping. The veneer of perfection that Sloane had spent her life polishing was cracking under the pressure of reality. She couldn't attend the gala because she couldn't pay for the ticket. She couldn't show her face because the rumors were starting to swirl not about the fraud yet, but about the money. In a town like West Briar, being broke was a social death sentence. But Sloane wasn't done. I thought the investigation was the end of it. I thought she would go to ground, lawyer up, and try to survive. I underestimated her delusion. On Saturday morning, 5 days after the dinner, I was sitting on my balcony drinking coffee. The sun was shining. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt since Logan died. Then my phone chimed with an email notification. It was from the credit monitoring service I had set up for Eli immediately after the dinner. I had locked his credit, putting a freeze on all 3 bureaus. Alert blocked inquiry. I frowned, setting my coffee down. I opened the app. Date today, 8:15 a.m. Action attempted new credit application. Lender quick cash online lenders. Status blocked. Due to security freeze. I stared at the screen. The blood drained from my face. This wasn't an old inquiry surfacing late. This was from this morning. Sloane or someone with access to her devices had tried to use Eli's information again. After I confronted her, after I showed her the folder, after I filed the internal report, after Grant called me weeping, after everything, she hadn't stopped. She hadn't learned. She was so desperate, so convinced of her own entitlement, or perhaps so vindictive, that she had tried to punch through the wall I had built around my son. She thought she could outsmart the freeze. She thought she could still use him. The audacity was breathtaking. It was pathological. I stood up, gripping the phone so hard the case creaked. This wasn't just a crime anymore. This was a war. She wasn't going to stop until she was physically forced to stop. I went back inside and grabbed my keys. I grabbed the folder, which I had updated with the scholarship letter and the printout of this new blocked inquiry. I wasn't going to call the police this time. I was done with phone calls. I was done with warnings. I needed to end this, and I was going to end it where it started. I texted Grant one word, meet. Then I texted my parents, come. I didn't invite Sloane. She would be there anyway. She was the rod at the center of the floorboards. And today, I was going to rip the whole house down to get her out. I chose the venue carefully. I did not want the mahogany dominance of my parents' dining room, nor the sterile, fluorescent judgment of a conference room at Cedar Line. I chose the Grindstone, a busy cafe on Main Street with floor-to-ceiling windows, bright natural light, and most importantly, high-definition security cameras positioned over every table. I wanted neutral ground. I wanted witnesses. I wanted a place where the Graham family could not hide in the shadows of their own denial. I arrived 20 minutes early. I ordered a black coffee that I did not intend to drink. I placed my folder on the table. It was thinner this time, containing only 3 documents: the confirmation of the credit freeze I had placed on Eli's file, the notification of the scholarship award, and the single sheet of paper that would end the war. They arrived together, a united front that looked less like a phalanx and more like a funeral procession. Sloane entered first. She was perfectly styled in a camel trench coat and designer sunglasses, but the details were wrong. Her hair, usually lacquered into submission, had a few stray flyaways. Her lipstick was a shade too bright, applied with a hand that must have been shaking. She looked brittle, like a porcelain vase that had been glued back together and was terrified of a strong breeze. Grant followed her. He looked hollow. His skin had a gray, pasty quality, and his eyes were sunken, rimmed with the dark circles of a man who had spent the last 5 nights staring at the ceiling, wondering when the police were coming. My parents brought up the rear. My father, Ray, walked with a belligerent stiffness, his jaw set in a line of defensive anger. My mother, Janine, looked small and frightened, clutching her purse as if it contained the last of her dignity. They sat down. The chairs scraped loudly against the concrete floor. No one ordered coffee. The waitress approached, took one look at the tension radiating from our table like heat from a fire, and wisely retreated. "This is unnecessary," my father started, his voice a low growl. "Dragging us out to a public place on a Sunday. We could have discussed this at the house." "There is no home field advantage today. Dad," I said. My voice was calm, pitched just loud enough to be heard over the hiss of the espresso machine, but soft enough to keep our business private. "We are doing this in the light. We told you we would handle it," my mother whispered, leaning in. "Grant is withdrawing the application. He promised. Why are you still punishing us?" "I am not punishing you," I said. "I am updating you." I looked at Sloane. She was staring out the window, refusing to meet my eyes. She was tapping her fingernails against the laminate table, a frantic, rhythmic clicking. "Sloane," I said. She didn't turn. "Sloane, look at me." She whipped her head around, her eyes flashing with a sudden, desperate fury. What do you want?" "Kendall, you won." "Okay." "The bank froze the account. Grant is hiring a lawyer. We are ruined. Are you happy? Do you want me to bleed for you?" "I want you to stop lying," I said. "I stopped," she hissed. "I haven't touched anything. I have been in bed for 3 days." "That is a lie," I said. I picked up the single sheet of paper, the printout of the blocked inquiry from Saturday morning. I slid it across the table. It stopped right in front of Grant. "This happened after Sunday," I said. "This happened yesterday morning, at 8:15. Grant looked down at the paper. He read the text. Attempted new credit application. Lender Quick Cash Online. Applicant Eli Graham. Status blocked. The color, what little was left of it, vanished from his face. He stared at the paper for a long time, his brain trying to process the timeline. Sunday dinner was the explosion. Monday was the report. Wednesday was the plea for mercy. And Saturday was this. Grant turned to Sloane. His movement was slow, mechanical. He looked stunned, like a man who had just been stabbed by someone he was hugging. "You said you stopped," Grant said. His voice was barely audible. "Sloane, You swore to me. You swore on the boys' lives that it was over. Sloane froze. She looked at the paper, then at Grant, then at me. For a second, I saw the gears turning, looking for an excuse, a scapegoat, a glitch, but there was nowhere to go. The timestamp was absolute. She stammered. I just needed to cover the retainer for the lawyer. They wouldn't take a check. Grant, I had to find the money somewhere. So you tried to steal from him again? Grant asked, his voice rising. After everything, after Kendall warned us, after I begged you. I didn't have a choice, Sloane snapped, slamming her hand on the table. The sudden noise made a couple at the next table look over. Sloane didn't care. The mask was gone. She was raw. Ugly rage. Do not look at me like that, she screamed at Grant. I did this for us. I did this to keep this family afloat because you couldn't get a job. You think this is easy. You think I like scrambling like a rat. I have carried the weight of this image for 10 years. Grant, I have to be perfect because you are mediocre. She turned on me, her eyes wild. And you, she spat. You self-righteous, bitter little widow. You think you are so noble. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous. You wanted to see me fail because it makes your sad little life look better. You pushed me to this. If you hadn't been so judgmental, if you hadn't made me feel like I had to compete, I wouldn't be in this position. Stop it, my father shouted. The table went silent. My father was breathing hard, staring at Sloane. He looked horrified. He had spent his life defending her, framing her cruelty as strength and her greed as ambition. But this screaming, blaming, chaotic mess in the middle of a coffee shop, he couldn't spin this. Sloane, my father said, his voice shaking, you tried to use Eli's number yesterday. I had to, she cried. It is just a number. Dad, who cares? He is 10. He doesn't need credit. He is your nephew, my mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. He is family. I am family, Sloane shrieked. I am the one you are supposed to protect, not him, me. I watched her unravel. It was tragic, in the classical sense. She was a woman who had bought into a lie so completely that she was willing to cannibalize her own blood to keep it alive. You are done, I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through her hysteria like a guillotine. You do not get to use my child's name to fund your illusion, I said. Not once, not ever again. I opened the folder again and took out a notepad. I placed it on the table. Here is how this ends, I said. There is one path forward where I do not walk out of here and drive straight to the police station to file a supplemental report for the second attempt. That second attempt proves intent. Sloane, it proves you are a habitual offender. No judge on earth would give you probation for that. Sloane was panting, her chest heaving, but she was listening. The word police had pierced her fog. 1, I said, you will sign a formal admission of guilt for the bank, not a vague apology. A specific admission that you, and you alone, used Eli's information without authorization. This clears Eli's record permanently. It ensures that no matter what happens to you, his history is scrubbed clean. I looked at Grant. 2, Grant, you will set up a restitution plan. I don't care if you have to sell the house. I don't care if you have to sell the cars. You will pay back every cent of the debt you accrued in the last 6 months so that no creditors come looking for my son. I will, Grant said immediately. I will list the house tomorrow. And 3, I said, looking at my parents, then at Sloane. No contact. What? My mother gasped. Sloane is not to come near Eli, I said. No surprise visits, no phone calls, no showing up at his school recitals, no family dinners, until she has completed therapy and I have seen proof of change. She does not exist to him. She is a danger to him. She is a predator, and I do not let predators near my son. That is too harsh, my father said, though his protest lacked its usual fire. She is his aunt. She is an identity thief, I corrected him. And if you try to facilitate contact, If you try to sneak him over to see her, I will cut you off too. I will change my number. I will move. Do not test me on this." My father looked at me. He looked at the daughter he had dismissed as weak, as a mess, as a failure, and he saw someone he didn't recognize. He saw a fortress. I had one last thing to show him. I slid the cream-colored envelope across the table. "Read it," I said to my father. He picked it up with trembling hands. He pulled out the letter from the Piedmont Conservatory. He adjusted his glasses. He read the acceptance. He read the scholarship amount. He read the dean's note about the essay on grief and resilience. He lowered the paper slowly. He looked at the scholarship offer, full tuition, merit-based, for a program that his successful grandchildren couldn't get into with all the tutors in the world. He looked at Sloane, who was sobbing into her hands, broken and exposed. Then he looked at me. "He got a full scholarship?" my father asked quietly. "Yes," I said. "Because he is brilliant, and because he is strong. He wrote an essay about losing his father and finding himself. He didn't need your structure, Dad, and he didn't need Sloane's example of success. He did it on his own." My father swallowed hard. He looked at the letter again, running his thumb over the embossed seal. The narrative he had clung to, that Eli was a damaged boy who needed saving, and that I was an incompetent mother who needed guiding, dissolved in his hands. "I was wrong," he said. It was a whisper, but it was there. "I was wrong," he repeated, looking up at me. His eyes were wet. "About him. About you." I nodded. I didn't need his apology to feel whole, but I accepted it as a surrender. "We are leaving now," I said. "Grant, I expect that admission letter by tonight. Sloane, get help." I stood up. I buttoned my coat. I picked up my empty coffee cup and placed it on the tray near the trash can. I didn't look back at the table. I walked out of the cafe, into the bright, sharp sunlight of the afternoon. I drove home. The knot in my chest, the one that had been there for 4 years, was gone. When I walked into the condo, the smell of pepperoni pizza filled the air. Eli was on the couch, setting up the movie. He had chosen The Iron Giant, our favorite. "Hey, Mom," he said, looking up with a smile that reached his eyes. "Is it done?" "Yeah, bud," I said, locking the deadbolt and sliding the chain into place. "It is done." I walked over to the small desk in the corner. I took the folder, the one with the evidence, the logs, the ugly truth of my family, and I put it in the bottom drawer. I locked the drawer. I didn't need to look at it again. I went to the couch and sat down next to my son. He leaned his head on my shoulder. I wrapped my arm around him, feeling the solid, warm weight of him. He was safe. His name was his own. His future was his own. I looked around our sad little condo. It was warm. It was paid for. It was filled with love that didn't ask for a credit check. My father had been wrong about a lot of things, but he was right about one thing: tables matter. But he didn't understand that the value of the table isn't the linen or the silver or the people sitting around it pretending to be perfect. The value of the table is the peace of the people sitting at it. I had finally chosen a table where my son never has to earn his worth again, and that was the only victory I ever needed. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can get this story out to more people.